So with that, let me quickly get started. See if I can move forward. I'm from Istanbul, Turkey. I went to Stanford to get my bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees. I was in the Stanford Technology Ventures program in the Management Science Department, working with Kathy Eisenhardt. And based on this training, of course, I do quite a bit of qualitative work, and especially thinking about single, comparative, and multiple case studies. Kathy's research is mostly in the multiple case area, but I've started to do a bit more single and comparative cases depending on the situation. And we'll talk about how to make those choices in this session. I also had the chance to work with technology entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, which really helped my research. And then later on, I also worked a little bit in Germany, Siemens. And in my academic career, I have been in 3 institutions. I started as an assistant professor at ESA Business School. Then I was an associate professor at Warwick Business School in the UK. And I have been a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at Oxford since 2019. And very briefly, my topics are strategy, entrepreneurship, with a particular interest in technology markets, and also a little bit of change and change management in organizations. Within that, I look at topic-wise entrepreneurial strategy, interfirm ties, platforms, ecosystems, and also at the macro level, the evolution of technology markets. I have been looking at different settings. You can see some of those settings on the left there. And in these studies, looking at, again, the 3 areas of focus: entrepreneurial strategy at the top, market evolution, and interfirm ties. And several of my studies are within 2 of those areas, really, because you can look at the organizational level phenomenon, for example, strategy, and then the way that, based on firm strategy, industries evolve, which is quite fun to see. It's almost like building a puzzle and then looking at the big picture. So that's pretty much about me. Here at Oxford, I am doing quite a bit of work in technology, but my focus has shifted a little bit to the issues of data related strategy, so AI startups, as well as looking into how technology firms are disrupting highly regulated industries. You have read one of my studies about a highly regulated industry, which is the pay TV industry, which was an archival comparative case. Currently, I'm doing quite a bit of single and multiple cases in the area of fintech, so financial industry being disrupted by technology ventures. And it's a really fun area to look at, looking at what entrepreneurship is like when the setting is highly regulated. And we can talk a little bit about that within our session. Now, let me unshare and give the word over to Suho. Suho is a co-author of mine, and he's an amazing scholar who worked with Melissa Grabner, who's another of Kathy's amazing students. And Suho is an expert in single cases as well as multiple cases. And he'll tell a little bit about his background, and then he'll get us started on single cases. Over to you, Suho.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Pinar, Ibrat. Really excited to be here today. So thank you for organizing this and thinking of me to be involved as a participant. I don't have slides for this part. I do have slides for later when I talk about the current project I'm working on now. So I'll just to keep that in mind. So a little bit about myself. I'm currently an assistant professor in the entrepreneurship department at Syracuse University in the United States. Like Pinar mentioned, I got my PhD at the University of Texas at Austin. I worked under Melissa Grabner, who's been trained by Kathy. And so I've gotten that training through like multiple cases for my dissertation. Given the international crowd here, I also have an international background. I'm originally from Korea, and I spent time in Korea growing up, and my family lives there. And so I go back and forth quite a bit. And so while I was getting my PhD, I think being in Austin, where there's a lot of activity for entrepreneurs and startups, I think it's a great place to get exposed to field research, and also having a good mentor kind of guide me through that process. And so I'm a little bit more on the junior side compared to Pinar, so I think I'll have more insight or hopefully answer some questions from people in that stage of their careers. In terms of my work largely explores two streams so far. So one stream broadly examines how entrepreneurial firms navigate their environments as they grow, gain, shed resources, with a particular focus on how entrepreneurs gain resources. So entrepreneurial resource acquisition. And I have a couple projects here with settings. One is a single case study, which I'll share more details about today later. That's in a high-tech venture. Have another paper that looks at more social enterprises. So that's my first stream. The second stream I look at is more based on my dissertation, which is broadly under the thematic kind of area of how unconventional organizations organize. And so that's in the setting of angel investor groups. And I'm drafting that with being close to submission. And then third stream with my interest in more developing best practices for qualitative work, whether that's multiple cases and or single cases. And also expanding interest in health tech settings. So I think that's really interesting, kind of similar to Pinar's work, but you have a really regulated and conservative industry where there's a lot of innovation going on and more technology-focused business models coming in. So I think there's a lot of interesting open questions there. So that's a little bit about me. And so I'll just go into the webinar topic today. And so I'll first talk about what are single cases and the rationales for using single cases from what we've observed through our book chapter. So Pinar and I, we wrote a book chapter on single cases where we looked really deeply into about like 30, 40 single case studies in the top management journals, and we found some common patterns. So what are single cases? So basically, you can think of it as an in-depth investigation into some singular unit of analysis, really at multiple levels typically and over a long period of time. So I think a really good and timely example today, because we're still in the COVID pandemic across the world. So a good example for medicine would be looking at the first infected patient of COVID-19, right? So even though that is a one single case, that would give a lot of insight that would help researchers develop new studies and even large scale statistical studies. So that's one good example of a single case. We've also found different examples of single cases in management. It could be at the team group level, usually the firm level, or even the market and industry level. Other examples may include an event, right? So we've looked at studies that looked at events like an M&A negotiation, a labor strike. It could also be a disaster. A really good exemplar is Carl Weick's study of the Man Gulch fire disaster, a classic ASQ study. And that looked at how these fire teams got confused and were unraveled and trying to understand how organizations can be more resilient. So looking at a particular disastrous event for management implications. Other examples could be a product or even a technology. There was a good study in SMJ looking at how new technology was being developed in a company. So just from those examples, single cases can be very versatile. So they can be at even the individual level analysis to an industry. So it really depends on how you want to use it in your research question. Some of the rationales for using a single case that we found. So we found 4 main rationales. And so I think this is really important as scholars think about, before they decide on a particular case, if the case fits one of these 4 rationales. So one was that, a case should be an unusual phenomenon of something, right? So this is can be thought of as the extreme case, right? So maybe it's some failed decision, maybe it's a failed M&A negotiation, maybe it's the first instantiation of a new technology, a new product, maybe it's a new industry. So that's usually the case for finding some extreme case, right? So thinking about unusual settings, kind of rare events, there was a really good AMJ, and they looked at anti-mafia organizations in Italy, right? So we don't have a lot of insight into that, but that would be an extreme case. A second reason for using a single case was that it hasn't been accessible to researchers before. So this is, in other words, a revelatory case, right? So maybe it's recently released archives that were previously classified that gives insight into a particular setting or phenomenon that researchers haven't had access to before. So that would be an example of that. One good study that we found was an example of this justification was the study looked at a labor strike in 1968. Obviously, the informants had passed away by the time the study was conducted, but there were a lot of historical documents and archival data that was available that this scholar used to really gain insight into this phenomenon. So that would be an example of more of a revelatory case. A third reason was that the case could be observed longitudinally. So we think about a setting where you can see something, where you can see a phenomenon occur over several years, maybe even several decades. So you can think about examples like maybe new market, new industry at inception until maturity, or even how people or teams resolve conflicts, multiple conflicts over time in a firm. So that would be another example of cases where you can see it over long periods of time. And the final rationale for using a single case was that the single cases provide really fine-grained level of detail that other methods, such as multiple cases, don't provide, or that they're too costly to do, right? So we found examples of looking at maybe different levels of analysis within a single case, such as embedded cases. Maybe you get different perspectives from different groups of informants within the single case, and obviously using multiple sources of data to look at the phenomenon from different angles. So those are the four reasons, four kind of rationales for using a single case. And just to recap, they were, the case should be an extreme instantiation of something. So an extreme case, like really unusual phenomenon that people haven't had insight into before. It should be revelatory in terms of the case has not been accessible before to researchers. It should be able to be observed longitudinally over several years, maybe even decades, maybe even the lifetime of an entire company from founding to failure. So a longitudinal observation window. And also the case should provide insight from different perspectives, so different levels of analysis. Maybe you have different data sources to get that fine-grained level of detail that other methods aren't well really equipped to do. So those are the four main rationales. And I think as scholars do this, it's really important to articulate how your case fits one of those four rationales and or a mix of those four rationales. So I think that's really important as we've seen in other published work. So yeah, that's kind of the introduction of what are single cases, different examples, and also what are the rationales we've seen for using single case studies. Yeah. So I think I'll turn that back over to Pinar, and then she'll go into some of the importance of single cases and also some of her projects that use single cases.
Thank you so much, Suho, for this great introduction, explaining clearly the reasons. Ibrat, I wonder whether because there are already questions coming in, shall we maybe use this opportunity to take a few of them? I think that might be
that's a great idea.
Yeah. Are there any particular ones that you'd like to focus on?
Yeah, there's a question from Julius. Julius, would you like to pose your question directly? And there was also interesting questions from Nicole as well.
Sure. Sure, thanks a lot. So my question is regarding the formulation and the meaning, maybe even of the research questions behind those. Do we have to formulate those differently for single case studies, or a particular kind of research questions mostly used in these formats, especially compared to multiple cases?
Sure. So I think that's a great question. And I would say that the research questions for multiple cases tend to have a little bit of more of the variance logic in mind. So the differences that you might find in, for example, across firms or across teams or, across industries, etc., when you're thinking about multiple cases. Whereas the research questions for single cases are a bit more strictly kind of process oriented typically. Although a lot of multiple cases are, again, longitudinal and they do uncover a process, but the single case study, just by design, can't talk so much about the variance, and so therefore I would say that the multiple case has that logic a bit more. Suho, what do you think?
Yeah, so I totally agree with that. So yeah, single cases are more, advantageous to look at some process over time, how things unfold. So usually what we've seen is some kind of question that looks at how does X happen over time, or how do teams do such and such over time. So yeah, like Pinar mentioned, because you can't do any comparison. So that's usually the focus, yeah, that we've seen.
Yeah, exactly. But I would also add that from a research question, you might find that the same research question can be answered by a single study or by a multiple case study. Just it depends a little bit on your focus. But typically, studies where you get to compare firms, or again, like teams, business units, etc., their research questions tend to be a little bit different in terms of variance. Let's take another, maybe.
Nicole, did you want to ask a question?
Hi, yeah, I have two questions. The first one is, would you recommend a case study for somebody who still has to write their dissertation?
Great question. Suho, you have graduated more recently. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think it's a bad idea. I would first suggest, definitely consulting with your advisor on kind of the logistics of that, and also whether the single case makes sense for the research question you're doing, and also like the expected timeline for completion. Because single cases can also lead to multiple papers, because you'll be looking at phenomena maybe from different levels of analysis within the case or from different perspectives. So I don't think just because it's a single case you should be discouraged, but obviously there's more, probably more challenges possibly.
Yeah. Okay.
Really thinking closely with your advisor and kind of planning that.
Yeah. Thank you for answering the question about if I could publish more than one paper, because I wasn't quite sure if you had to use the data set, and then would you be able to publish like multiple papers from the same data set? I mean, like you must be able to.
Yeah, I think so, Nicole, that your goal should in fact be to publish multiple papers, at least two, I would say, from a single case study, which by design just takes much longer compared to like quantitative work or even multiple case studies sometimes, because you have to provide that richness of the data, and that takes time to develop, right? And so therefore, your goal should be that. And let me tell you kind of anecdotally, I didn't think actively about how to write more than one paper for my dissertation. I had one big dissertation, not the 3-paper model, which during my time that was more common. And I really struggled to publish my second paper from the same dissertation. Because I hadn't designed it with the idea of publishing multiple papers, the things that I tried to develop for the second paper, almost like, half of the time I would cannibalize the first paper, and the first paper was under revise and resubmit, and I didn't want to cannibalize it. And so it took me actually close to 10 years to publish that second paper from the first dissertation. And I think that what I learned from that process is that to actively design your study such that you look at either several different aspects of the same thing, or you have different multiple layers that you're going to analyze in different papers, but to make that choice, and even in your interviews and in your observations, to ask your questions such that you are developing in your head both papers in parallel.
That's a very good point. Thank you so much.
Of course. Alrighty. Shall we move on?
Can I just ask one more question,
Yeah,
just
right.
based on that, whilst we're on this topic? What about maybe using the same organization? So not necessarily the same data set to publish the papers, but the same organization to do multiple research projects. Do you have any views on that?
Of course. So typically, and this is my very honest view from experience, organizations typically are very excited to open their doors to you, especially because if they like the research question, the project, etc. However, because they're not used to the way that academic work works, they almost expect in return some sort of a consulting project, which is not something that is in your interest to deliver. I mean, obviously you should share a practitioner version of your paper, as well as maybe do a presentation, share your learnings. But in a sense, my experience has been that there's a kind of mismatch of expectations sometimes. And in order to do multiple studies with the same organization, that process and those expectations need to be managed very well, such that from the beginning, you show them examples of what you're going to provide and how they can use that, and how in the future you could do more studies. One of the ways to do that would be to propose a larger research agenda with several different milestones. And then your second paper is the, whatever milestone. So it just moves forward, but the understanding is that this is a multi-year project. Because typically once they kind of open their doors and kind of you interview them, etc., they sometimes I hear the question, oh, didn't we just do that? Why are we doing it again? What's in it for us this time, right? So you need to really manage the expectations in order for them to feel like they're getting something out of a longitudinal collaboration with you. Suho, would you like to add anything to?
Yeah, just from my experience with, so I've had through my dissertation, it was a multiple case actually, but I was involved with several angel investor groups. And I thought one good way to keep that relationship open for kind of future follow-ups was just to give them periodic updates of where you were in the process, or even do something as simple as reaching out, sending an email, maybe even around the holidays, to even kind of update them and make sure that you were still on their radar in case you had to go back to them for any follow-up interviews or other follow-up questions. Yeah. So I think that's also something to keep in mind. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. So let's move forward a little bit. I'll tell you a little bit about the why, kind of when does it make sense to do a study, and it in a sense it's another version of the same question that Suho was answering before, which is the logic behind, the rationale behind single case studies. Let me quickly share. Okay. So Suho explained to you 4 different reasons, rationales for why we should do a single case study. It's if it's a complex kind of organizational phenomenon, if it's unusual, if you have unusual access, if it's a rare phenomenon. So either you have unusual access or the phenomenon itself is unusual. And then it could also be that you need such fine-grained level of detail that multiple cases would not allow you to do that. Now, my first question to you is, are these mutually exclusive? Or could it be that the first case, the one single case could be many of these things? What do you guys think? feel free to just unmute yourselves or raise your hand. Yes,
It can be several of those.
Yeah, I would agree with Maria that a lot of these overlap. You know, like you might have unusual access, but also it's some emergent phenomenon, and maybe you look at an extreme case of that phenomenon.
Exactly, exactly. And it's what's also interesting is that before you go in and before you do the study, it's usually not possible to see that it may be a rare phenomenon. So typically the third reason emerges over time. You start to study it, and sometimes you may be studying something else. Like we have this paper with a co-author on how organizations become hybrid over time. And the study was about something else. It was about kind of this technology related thing. And then once we started doing interviews, we realized that there was an unusual phenomenon here, which we started to study. So in a sense, the rareness of the phenomenon doesn't have to come from the beginning. You may be understanding that this is rare as you go in. And an example of that, which was one of the kind of recommended readings for the session, is the study that I did with Felipe Santos on mobile payments, where when we started studying the phenomenon, it was about the emergence of a new market, which is mobile payments. I mean, payments market, finance exists, mobile exists, but mobile payments didn't exist at that point in time. And as we studied it in real time, we realized that this was an unusual phenomenon because the market was just not emerging. You know, we studied it for several years, like 6-7 years, and conversations were going on, you know, pilots were going on, but nobody was really launching this product, which from a technical standpoint was ready. And so you could really kind of, as you observe the phenomenon, you might realize an unusual phenomenon emerging, unfolding, which is really fun and exciting to look at. Okay, so rule of thumb, unusual access, observation longitudinally, and Yin actually has one of the kings of qualitative research. Yin has a way to describe this as either extreme revelatory or longitudinal, which is a good rule of thumb. Thinking about our studies, which one is it that we're looking into? Because you need to, when you're sending a single case to a journal, typically you need to justify why you did a single case, because the first kind of line of attack will be, how generalizable is this? And you need to be ready for that question. And that question could be answered with this rationale, right? You know, you could say, okay, this is an extreme case, and we learn from understanding this extreme case. For example, we'll talk in a little bit about the Tripsa-Sangavetti Polaroid study. That's an extreme case, but it's extreme in the good, and that actually helps us learn about how organizations can overcome hurdles in technology adoption, and therefore it's valuable. It's revelatory. It's a complex phenomenon that we didn't understand. Or, for example, in my current fintech studies, we need to study the unfolding of a regulatory change over time. And if you don't follow this over time, you won't be able to tell kind of the different steps. So these are a good way to justify that study. And my personal recommendation would be to already justify in a paragraph why you chose to do a single study when you are sending your study to a journal. Don't wait for that question. Because then, you know, at the beginning, reviewers are potentially less critical, whereas if they already wondered that, it will be more difficult to convince them later on. So the Tripsa-Sangavetti study, this is a study of Polaroid, and it's like they went in and they looked into how this organization was coping. And as I said, it's an unusual case of organizational inertia, but in the positive, in the sense that one would expect Polaroid to have difficulty adopting to a completely unrelated digital imaging or imaging technology in general. But the authors find that they have little problem overcoming the path dependencies, and that makes it unusual and worthy. And going back to Suho's example of the Mann Gulch fire, that is an unusually horrible case, right? it is a case where just things fell apart. And that is also valuable in terms of learning. So think about why both are important to learn from. I mean, obviously lives were lost there, and the fact that this organizational lack of coordination happened is actually quite valuable to understand, to avoid it in the future. So the good extreme and the bad extreme typically are quite interesting when we think about this. And so what these guys did in that study, in the Polaroid study, is that they got data, interviews over time, and what was important was not just interviews, but archival data, rich internal archival data, which you can get access to typically. And what's even more important is multiple perspectives, like different functions, different levels within the organization in order to understand the perspective. And sometimes, so I'm both Suho and I do quite a bit of reviewing and kind of editing. I work, and also Suho works with Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal. And one of the things that, and I'll also ask Suho to comment on this in a second, one of the typical issues that we see is that in a single case typically, but also in multiple cases, people's only interview top management. And top management says, oh, this is the direction we wanted to go, for example, or this is what we decided to do, and then we went for it, etc. There are several issues with this. Top management typically only is less involved in the implementation, and therefore they may not give you the types of trade-offs or dilemmas that the organization actually faced in the implementation. And they typically have an interest to show things rosier than they are. And so just interviewing top management, depending on what you're trying to do, but just interviewing top management in order to understand an organizational level phenomenon can be problematic. Suho, what do you think about this issue?
Yeah, so I totally agree on that. And just to add that, I think I would say, yeah, try to get data on those closest to the phenomenon. So going back to Pinar's example, if you're also looking at how a strategy is implemented, it would make sense to interview both the top managers who came up with the strategy and either the middle managers or the employees involved with the actual implementation. So you would get multiple perspectives on that singular phenomenon. So I think yeah, that's one of the advantages of a single case, is that to really take advantage of the single case methodology, you want to get multiple perspectives, multiple angles of a particular phenomenon. Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, that's critical, because those multiple perspectives may end up being at the core of your findings, like the fact that there was actually disagreement. Unless you ask different levels, different functions, you wouldn't be able to find that out. And so it's not just good practice, but it may drive your findings.
Mm-hmm. And just want to add to that. And I think some of the really interesting studies that we'll come across are things with a lot of tension or conflict in the phenomenon or how things are rolling out. So just building on what Pinar mentioned, I think ways to get at that possible tension is to interview people or get data from different perspectives and not just one. Yeah, exactly.
So one of the things that I always tell my students just along those lines is, whenever you're doing interviews, ask your informants what were their challenges, and if they had a magic wand, what would they change? Or if they could do it again, what would they do differently? Look for tensions, look for mistakes, because that gives you a realistic study. Mm-hmm. Julius, you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much. So I was wondering also the slide before, and especially since you were now bringing up this multiple level who you ask question, because not only Yin, but also others frame a case within a context. Like even this notion is a little bit confusing for me, because what is the case? For instance, is the case like Polaroid, the company, and the context is maybe the digitalization technology industry? Or is it rather that they look inside the company and the change process is the case and the context is the company? Or is it maybe even that you can frame it that different levels that you ask are the individual cases in the same context? So this is like, how do you know how to frame it? Because you can do everything as you want, but then it wouldn't make any difference.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I agree that you could frame it in different ways, but some of those ways to frame wouldn't fly with the reviewers. So let me tell you a bit more. For example, if you were to try to frame the Polaroid study as a multiple case study, because you talked about different units, etc., then that wouldn't fly, because this is one organization and the way that do things may be particular. Right. Or if I were to claim in my mobile payment study, this is one industry that I studied. And yes, I have different countries, but it's all within one industry. And there are some specific characteristics of that industry that may or may not be generalizable to others. And so typically, in a sense, the way you decide whether this is a single case or not goes through the question of generalizability. And typically, if you're studying one organization, you would be better off calling it a single case study, unless you're studying a larger kind of consortium kind of organization with multiple members, etc. But even in that case, I would say that calling it a nested study and thinking about this one global case or one larger organization within which you have kind of nested cases. So, for example, I see studies as an editor, I see studies of looking at several partnerships of the same organization, right? So that will be a nested study, like partnerships within one organization. And I think that calling it a multiple case study when that's a forced situation is worse than calling it a single case and dealing with generalizability questions. Suho, let me get your view on that.
I would, to add to that, I think what really distinguishes multiple case from single is that to remember that multiple cases use that logic of replication, where each case is its own unit of analysis and you're comparing, contrasting all the time. But for that single case, that logic isn't there. And also, I think one good way to think about case versus context is that case is your main analytical kind of unit analysis. There's clear kind of some analytical boundary on it. So if your research question is on how does organization change over time, that obviously the case would be the organization, and then maybe the context is just what's going on in the environment, but that wouldn't be your main focus. So maybe that's another way to think about kind of case versus context. But yeah, I agree. That can be sometimes confusing, and it's a good question.
Great, Maria. Did you want to ask a question, Maria?
Yes, thank you. My question is more about multiple case studies, but as I was listening to all of your recommendations, I always struggle with when I see multiple cases in different industries. It's a big challenge because sometimes I think that what the authors are really focusing on is a phenomena. And it's kind of like a coincidence that they're looking at it in different industries. So always the comment comes up that how are you controlling for industry effects, right? So I would like to know, as an editor, what's your perspective on that?
Sure, I'll say a few words and also ask Suho. I think that looking at similar or kind of the same phenomenon across industries is a strength. However, when we think about study design, in a sense, the logic should always be, what am I keeping the same? What am I varying, right? So if you are keeping the phenomenon the same or similar enough such that they can be compared across industries, that is a strength. However, sometimes industry characteristics may direct the phenomena differently. So for example, right now I'm looking at how entrepreneurs strategize with data-driven business models. I see big differences between highly regulated industries such as healthcare, banking, etc., versus just retail manufacturing. And so that to me gives variance, and understanding the industry differences allows me to get that variance, and that is important to me. Sometimes the way that a study unfolds is that you start in one industry, or you're thinking of one or two different industries which are similar. And then as you start to hear the phenomenon, you start to realize that there may be a good contrasting industry to look at. Or it could be that same organization says, oh, you know, if I were in this industry, it would be different because blah, blah. But, you know, the regulator is on my back, and therefore I can't ask people for their sensitive data, et cetera, et cetera. And so thinking about how to, sometimes I add industries or I add additional organizations in order to compare, to arrive at a multiple case. The cases in an ideal world would all start around the same time, but as you do pilot interviews, or as you do the first interviews with your organizations, you might then think about, okay, these are some of the other good cases to compare, and then you might quickly go and start that comparison process. Suho?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think if you're doing across industry multiple cases, maybe you're grouping 3 cases in one industry and then 3 cases in another industry, and maybe those 2 industries are fairly similar, that you're observing them from the beginning. They have maybe similar structure, but maybe something about them is slightly unique, where that's where it's providing some kind of variance across. And so you can, so maybe the analysis allows you to see what are some common properties of when, let's say, a new technology emerges in these 2 industries, but also what are some of the differences. So I think that would be a possible idea of how to use multiple cases across industries, but also kind of justify that choice. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. We'll also take the question from Jacob, and then we'll move on.
Yes, thank you. I had a follow-up question on this, trying to make a difference between single case studies and multiple case studies. Mm-hmm. Especially in the case of nested or embedded single case studies.
Yeah.
But it's more of a matter of framing. So I'm just wondering how to frame or to phrase the way you sought for example, you sought for clients or informants within an organization or managers within an organization. You cannot talk about replication. Can you talk about the theoretically sampled informants? Can you say that we try to compare different subunits within a case? So more of like trying not to confuse reviewers or others about like what is the logic behind how you sampled those subunits within your case. That's something I find pretty difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it is not easy. Let me try to answer that through a small example. Imagine that you're looking into the adoption of some technology. I recently did a study with another student from Stanford, who Doug Hanna, who together we were looking at the way that advertising firms were adopting social media as an advertising channel. And so there, imagine that you're looking at one advertising firm, and then the way that social media is interpreted within that advertising firm really depends on who you're talking to. Different departments like creative, and then the different media, the types of media specialty departments, and top management, etc., they all have different views. In this case, we can't really think, as Suho said, we can't really think about a replication logic, because we're trying to understand the interaction of those different views in order for the phenomenon to unfold as we experienced it. Whereas if you want to think about, for example, this will be what I just described would be a single study. You could go into, say, WPP, global organization, and then you could interview different departments and then think about how social media gets adopted by an advertising industry and how their tensions and their different views and interpretations of that technology by different departments. That will be a single case study. If you wanted to look into how, for example, the research question could then be how do incumbent firms adopt a new technology, and then looking at multiple perspectives from within. Whereas if you wanted to do a multiple case study, then you would naturally go to WPP and a few of their competitors, and then you would look into similar departments, interview them, and then you would start to draw similarities across, saying the creative team in all of these have said similar things, for example. It doesn't have to be by department, but you're looking for similarities which you can categorize. And then you basically say, okay, what I'm understanding is that when firms adopt a new technology, the ones that deal with the content that works with that technology, for example, have a certain point of view, and that creates tensions with those who actually work directly with the technology, for example. And then you could try to combine and build a multiple case study like that. But then what I would be doing in my example is that I'm talking to different firms, and I'm comparing the creative department in each firm to one another, right? So this will be one way to kind of think about how to differentiate. But if you're thinking about one industry, and for example, my mobile payment study of how the industry didn't emerge, the different people, different stakeholders that I'm talking to, banks, mobile operators, regulators, etc., their interaction actually creates the phenomenon. So therefore, you can't really think about a replication logic, right? And so that may be a way to think about how to differentiate between multiple versus single. I've talked too much. Suho, what would you like to add?
Yeah, so just to add, I would say, when you think about what could be embedded units within a single case, I would just suggest remembering that trying to get multiple perspectives over time, and that embedded units will help you do that. They may or may not allow you to look at replication within the case particularly, but I think embedded units will help you understand the phenomenon at a different perspective. Just to give another example, maybe your question is how does a firm's perspective of new investors change over time, right? So you can get, obviously the firm level would be the founders, executive team, you would get perspectives there, but also you get perspectives from maybe it's middle managers, recently joined employees. And so those would also be nested units of analysis within that larger case that would provide different views of those perceptions.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a bit more clear now. It's a bit work on to get it right there in the paper, but it's you gave me some new ideas, so thank you so much.
That's great. Fantastic. So let's maybe move on, because we do have a bit of something to say about comparative cases and kind of the comparison with the kind of nested cases, etc. So I'll quickly move on. I won't repeat some of the things that we've said. The idea of kind of supporting your interviews with extensive archival data is quite important, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And my own mobile payment study. So this study, again, going back to the rationales of why we're doing studies, this one was a complex phenomenon, but it was also unusual because typically, and also by default, we observe the industries that do emerge. Not typically, we don't observe industries that don't emerge. So I just happened to be there, and it captured the fact that it wasn't emerging, which also makes it unusual. It was also multiple moving parts. Different actors were interacting, and at the global level. And it required collaboration at the global level, and also longitudinal examination. And so basically, when we thinking about the how a little bit, what are some choices that you have? And just to summarize, this one is about the nested case, right? Logical subunits within the single one is what we just talked about. How do you decide whether to do that versus not? And here's a nice rule of thumb, the Tripsis and Gavetti versus Ozcan and Santos. There's also Galunik and Eisenhardt, which is a good example. Tripsis and Gavetti have the organization, and it's one holistic study, whereas Ozcan and Santos do the logical subunits, where the subunits are countries, because in each country, the industry is trying to emerge, but there are different types of obstacles and different outcomes. So therefore, that's the replication logic there. Therefore, that's a nested case. And the rule of thumb, which we find in our review with Suho, is that when the case is at the org level, but you have work teams, kind of venture projects, departments, etc., that can be compared, then you can think about it as an embedded case study. Galunik and Eisenhardt, so they have this one organization they look at business units and synergies, and they compare business units. And so that will be a great case of nested study. But you can also have a more holistic process and the logic there again goes back to variance versus similarity. Do you observe variance? Do you observe similarity? Can you provide a comparison is the main question. And if the answer is that the subunits don't really add any theoretical insight, or there are no clear subunits because these people all work together. If you're going to the individual level, if you're thinking about individuals, you've gone too far in trying to find subunits, right? So you need to stay for strategy research. Typically, you need to stay at the group level at least, or unit level. And so, for example, we have Vori and Hui's Nokia study. It's holistic, but the data is from several levels, just like we talked about before the Tripsis and Gavetti study, top management, middle management, engineers, etc. And that's a good rule of thumb, right? Thinking about whether you have clear subunits versus not. The other one, and we'll open it up to discussion soon, but the other one is comparative cases versus single cases, right? Comparative cases are not multiple cases. They're also not single cases. It's typically two comparisons, so it's two cases. And there's quite a bit of value in thinking about that, because it allows you to still go really deeply into the data and show the richness of your data and kind of really the quotes and everything, which in multiple cases you have kind of a bit of limitation to do. But at the same time, especially if you have variance, if you have no variance whatsoever between the cases, then comparative cases are a bit less meaningful in the sense that then you could go deeper into one organization. And by the way, I also looked at this other organization and the process was similar, because then if you're focusing on a similarity, then one case would probably be enough. But if you observe differences, if you have extreme, they started the same, and then they went into different directions, etc., then that is a good opportunity to do a comparative case, again, because you can go really deeply into the cases and show the similarities and the differences. And again, rule of thumb, what are you keeping similar? What are you varying? And can you explain the variance theoretically? One example here, which was in your recommended list, was the pay TV study that I did with my co-author, Kerem Gürses. And there, the idea is that they're entrepreneurs in the society in the US. They want to bring cable TV into homes. There are those they want to bring pay TV into homes, but there are two ways to do that. You can either do it over the air, so through regular signals, or you do it through cable. Over the air is cheaper, and there's already public channels that do that. So you would think, kind of intuitively, that will be the easier path. But it turns out that ends up being the more difficult path, because that goes head to head with existing free channels, ad subscription, ad-based channels. And so the cable one, against all odds, actually ends up being the successful one, which means that all these towns have to be wired, right, in order to receive this cable TV. And so that is a good example of how there are two attempts at the same thing, but one of them fails and the other one doesn't, and that gives you the kind of the material, the juice to compare the two. All right, so that's kind of it, and we are now at the top of the hour, and I have a little bit more in terms of field access, and then kind of studies, etc. I believe this is my final slide. Let me see. Yes. Let me quickly go through this, and then maybe we'll open it up for a discussion. This is just very practical advice in terms of what to do, what not to do. Sometimes you might not have currently have access to the phenomenon that you're trying to interrogate. I see, as an editor, I see a lot of studies that look at public material and try to make inferences about firm strategy. If you're observing the outcome, you don't know whether that outcome was intended or not, right? And so unless you have interviewed individuals, or if you have clear proof, even if it's secondhand material, such as a reporter interviewed this guy, etc. But even then, it's a little bit problematic because typically, as I said before, top management wants to show the best side of the organization. Unless you have truthful interviews, it will be quite difficult to look at things like intended, what the firm intended to do, because you're only observing the outcome. There are also ways in which you can make sense out of archival material. So, for example, in our pay TV study, we ended up using these, it was called Cable Mavericks, and there was this Cable TV Association in the 50s, way, before our time. None of those people are alive now. And those people, there were actually audio interviews with them as a way to showcase cable TV's success. And we went through all those audio files and treated them as interviews. Obviously, we had to tell our reviewers that these weren't our interviews, but that was great material for us. For longitudinal work, another unrelated piece of advice, make sure that you go back to the same individuals. That means practically you need to keep that relationship alive. You don't want to be a nuisance to them. They should want to speak with you again, which means that every time you go back, you need to bring them something that is worthwhile listening to, meaning knowledge, not a box of chocolates. But make sure that you make it worth their time, and clearly state in your paper, again, another typical mistake of papers that get submitted, state clearly how many of those individuals are repeat interviews versus new interviews. Because if you're claiming longitudinal kind of study design, you can't really not interview the same people and claim that you've understood how things unfolded, right? At least some of the interviews will be the same. Not everybody has to be the same as before, but you should have some of the repeat offenders, right? And you can also use, for example, this is something cheeky that we did with Doug in our strategy science study. We were looking to understand the phenomenon a little bit deeper, but we had conducted the interviews over 5 years ago, and it wasn't possible to go back to the same people, and those people kind of had moved on, etc. So we did something different. We said, okay, why don't we go to completely new individuals, not even in the same firms, because this is a cross firm, it's a multiple case study. And why don't we ask them whether the issues that we identified in the paper are still ongoing. So we went to those people and we basically explained to them the gist of what we were doing. And we asked them, like, how is social media treated in your organization today? So these were not new cases that we added, but these were just almost like confirmatory interviews, which we used in order to convince our reviewers. We did this between 2 revisions in order to convince our reviewers that the phenomenon was still ongoing. And there was a little bit about the generalizability issue. Oh, did you just happen to catch an industry at a turmoil time? And is it all better now? And therefore your study is not relevant. We showed them, no, this is still ongoing. People still have no clue within an advertising industry how to treat social media compared to TV, for example. So this was useful to us. And just to quickly finish before I give the word to Samar, make sure you audio record your interviews, ask for permission at the beginning. Clearly state that this is for your own research and that you will not be sharing that with anyone. At the same time, please, please, please do also take notes. I cannot tell you how many times those audio recordings don't function, or that like apparently your hand was right in front of it and there's all this hustle, and just make sure that you take good notes and transfer those notes into a Word file or whatever you're using after the interview. My rule of thumb is don't go to bed before transcribing your notes, because once you go to bed and wake up, half of it is gone. Whereas if you transcribe your notes into long format before you go to bed, then you will be able to capture 70–80% of the interview. That also makes your transcribing job much easier, right? So then you don't have to transcribe word for word unless the parts of the interview are not relevant for you. And finally, make sure you use observations, for example, at conferences, etc., as part of your single case process. For single cases, the more you can use different types of data, the better. Sometimes it's not clear whether, you can do an ethnography, for example, going into an organization. That is one approach, but observations are always a good idea. So think of ways to observe people in action, even if your main data source is semi-structured interviews or archival work, etc. So again, I've talked too much. Let me stop sharing and then give the word to Samar and then Divakar. Samar.
Thank you very much, Pinar. It's fabulous. I'm fond of single cases and multiple cases myself. I do more of qualitative ones. On your thought, when you were talking about longitudinal data, and in terms of you go to the same person, same people back, but after time, even in the next day, people are not same. They change. So each individual change. How do we cover that? And what kind of justification can we give on that, considering more specifically in knowledge intensive organization, if your interviewees are the knowledge intensive workers?
Mm-hmm.
Second question I want to ask is, I did my PhD study with case studies, and that's now 5 years old. And I still need to publish from this. And my concern is, with quants, we say it gets outdated very quickly. But in qualitative data, in those studies, it's not dated. I don't believe that it's dated yet. But there are still some struggles to justify my case in terms of its robustness as well as in terms of its datedness, although it's something that, that phenomenon as well as the cases, those organizations have still not been published anywhere else, even from any other countries as well. So what are the tips here?
Thank you, Samar. I'd like to give Suho the opportunity to answer. Let me just quickly summarize your questions. The first one is about the people, especially in knowledge-intensive industries, people kind of changing over time, and how do we handle that situation. And the second one is about the datedness versus not. Can you publish a study that is from 10 years ago, and how to handle that? Suho, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Yeah, I think those are great questions. For the first question, one idea could be, if someone's left, maybe interview someone who next filled that role. So if they're like the top engineer for a particular product group, that person's left, maybe try to explain to reviewers or the reader that this was inevitable, but to our knowledge, this new person that came in had these same responsibilities and so forth. So maybe that could be one idea for that case.
May I just interrupt? Really sorry. my point was slightly different. I was not saying that the people who had left or who are no more there, but the same person who have changed, who is more learned person now after time. So like after today's seminar, I'm more learned about the single case studies. So I'm not the same person who was before the seminar. And my study is actually about knowledge and knowledge loss and all that. So I need to be very careful of this explanation.
So that person, because they've gotten new knowledge, they provide this new perspective on what you're looking at, and how do you account for that? I think that's the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Can I chip in?
Sure.
Just a suggestion.
Yeah.
Hi, by the way, good to see you. Great talk. Thanks a lot. Oh, I think my camera is not visible. Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it's something we've been all kind of struggling with. But I think that the answer is very close to our philosophical assumptions, right? So I think what might offer some inspiration is as if you look at Joya, for instance, so interpretivist perspective, and then you assume that your informants are the best that they could give out of it. So you don't question what they tell you. You try to do your best in choosing your theoretical sample. And then this might change, like they're getting smarter over time, especially knowledge intensive industries, but you are not there to judge this. You take it as it is. And if you have some concerns regarding to their progress, that they might be progressing faster, maybe this means that you did not reach the data saturation yet, right? So something is going on. You should still collect some more data, or maybe you should consider, when do you stop? So what is the time frame for your research? Because sometimes you have some phenomena that, emergence of industries. You have to tell yourself that, okay, I cannot just study them for the next 10 years, or I can, but I cannot not to publish these results, not to report them. So I have to make this break for myself that, okay, I'm only looking until, I don't know, 2022. And then the rest, this is going to be my second, third, and fourth paper. So I would definitely direct it to Joya and like really revisiting some of the basic assumptions that I think we all know that, but sometimes, we might redirect our focus. I'm not sure if you guys would agree with that.
That makes a lot of sense, Agnieszka. And I also like Mohammed's answer on the chat. Well, one of the approaches could be that you, especially if you're dealing with knowledge and the way that they changed and what they have learned is important, I would try to ask them that question directly, but perhaps more importantly, get some kind of factual prompts about what has changed over time. So for example, have you been working on the same project? Have the people that you worked with changed? Last time you guys were a team of 4, has that changed? Who has joined, etc.? Look for ways in which their knowledge base would have changed, kind of that could be observed by you, because you cannot measure their knowledge, right? So you need to look for kind of factual information about the changes in their lives that could be clues about how they have changed over time. But obviously, I think, so the way that these individuals change are presumably also kind of at the core of your research question. And so that would be, it would be important to capture that then. And maybe for the second question, which is about being, the study getting dated as you try to, and maybe I'll add Agnieszka's kind of comment to that, which is, when do you stop collecting data? When do you say enough is enough? I'm going to actually go and publish this, which is not easy to do. Typically, I have published quite a few older studies, like things that were done. For example, this advertising study that I told you about, we stopped collecting data in 2013, and we published it in 2020. Okay, So there's a huge difference there. And obviously the way the social media is handled has changed tremendously. But what we tried to do to convince reviewers that this actually mattered was, first of all, saying, okay, this is about what organizations do when they're first introduced to a technology, which is relevant today. And you can motivate that both in your introduction of the paper, as well as in your discussion of at the end, where you talk about generalizability and why this study matters. Try to give current examples of how other organizations, other industries might be dealing with similar problems and why your results will matter and impact those studies. So that will be maybe one rule of thumb. And Suho, what do you think about that second question?
So just to add to that, I've also had that concern as well. I have some a paper with some interviews that are from a few years ago that I'm trying to publish as well. And I totally relate. But just to build off Pinar's comment, which I totally agree with, and maybe to say it another way, maybe your data is dated for a few years, but as long as you can present the theoretical puzzle as fresh and still at the forefront of a literature, I think that is what is the strength more of qualitative work, is to, we can use data, it may be a few years old, but the strength of that data is that it provides, insight into this theoretical puzzle that is still fresh in the minds of people in whatever literature you're trying to contribute to. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Your data, yes, it may be a few years old, but if you can present the question, the puzzle, in a way that's still fresh, I think that's something to remember.
Yeah, absolutely, Suho. And maybe also to relate it to Agnieszka's question, because you could drag out the same longitudinal study for 10 years or 15 years. You could be studying the same thing for a long time. When do you stop? It's difficult to decide, but my rule of thumb is to think about whether I'm observing an outcome that I could publish. Like, is it an outcome that is interesting by itself, or is it an outcome that would change if I observed it one more year, right? So for example, the fact that the mobile payments didn't, I started studying it in the year 2005 or so, and I studied it until 2011, also because, things were moving on, and then, it was longitudinal, and I also was working on it partially. But by the time I thought that this is enough, we can now publish this, it was very clear that the industry was not emerging, right? And when we published that study, 2015, coincidentally was the year when Apple announced that they would bring in Apple Pay. And that was great because, I couldn't really put it in the findings because it was in print already. But later on, it became like the things that were the findings of that study totally explained how Apple kind of solved that issue. And then, the industry emerged because it was about coordination. And Apple said, okay, screw it, we're going to do it by ourselves. But you need that global power in order to do it. Anyway, so basically, think about whether the outcome that you're observing is a stable enough outcome so that you could claim that this is something that wouldn't change very quickly, and that is a good point to stop, because you don't want to drag it out. And I tend to drag it out too long. That's why I have fewer studies compared to some of my colleagues. So it's important to think about when to stop. We have more questions, and I also wanted to tell you guys. Obviously. Questions about single cases are great, and this is what we're here for. But if you also have other questions regarding, like Suho, who's a great researcher who's been out a few years, and I've been out a few more years, and use us as kind of your sounding board for career advice as well. So any kind of questions are welcome. Divakar, I believe you were next.
Thank you, Pinar and Suho. This question is from multiple case study perspective. So in multiple case study, one can either choose similar industry or divergent, different type of industry. So I just want to understand your perspective, whether it is better to go for heterogeneous industry or homogeneous in terms of chances of getting published in some good journals?
So Divakar, I'll answer that shortly because we have talked a little bit about it before. Try to see whether the differences across industries make theoretical sense. They are a source of variance that you can put into your theoretical model, or whether they're just random and they don't contribute to your findings, in which case you're better off sticking to similar industries or to one industry. That will be my short response. Suho?
Yeah, just building off that, I think one of the strengths of using a single industry is that you can rule out some of those typical explanations for industry effects, and that will really help hone in on a particular phenomenon that you're seeing. So I think that's another thing to consider. So it really depends on the research question and whether you're trying to look at variance or process across the multiple cases.
Absolutely. Ibrat?
Thank you. Yeah, you highlighted that there are certain advantages to doing single case studies, particularly around developing insights, and that you can have a lot of data that allows you to probe deeper into the phenomena. But with a lot of data also comes the challenge of analyzing that data. And I was wondering whether you have any particular tips on, how can you bound and your analysis such that you don't drown in it. And related to this question is also, as we discussed earlier, trying to maybe come up with two publications out of the same data set. How can you separate that, or how can you conduct data analysis such that allows you to, create two ideas, so to speak? Thank you.
That sounds great, and I'll maybe ask Suho to go first this time.
Sure. In terms of bounding your analysis, I mean, so you don't, to prevent you from being drowned in the data, I guess. That's a good question. That's in the project I'm working on right now. We did have a lot of data, but as long as you focus on the data sources that are close to your phenomenon, I think that could be a good rule of thumb to help kind of make sure you're not drowning in all that data. For our paper, most of our data was like interviews. And so we really focused on that, and then also looked at the backgrounds of the informants and maybe how that affected perceptions over time. And so while we did have a lot of other data for like the firm history, which we used to construct the timeline, our main analytical focus was on the interview. So if there's a particular phenomenon and maybe more certain types of data make more sense to give more detail into that phenomenon, I think that would be a good rule of thumb to focus there and then use the other data to fill in the context.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, I think, Ibrat, your two questions are in fact related, because how do you not drown in that data, and then how do you kind of have a second paper out of that? I definitely agree with Suho, and sometimes the way that the findings and the analysis and therefore the findings evolve is that once the story, the thread, as the red thread, as we call, kind of emerges in your head, oh, I'm observing the following. This is really a case of blah, blah. Then I think you need to be quite critical in order to say, is this extra perspective, this extra interview, this extra whatever that I'm adding to the findings confirming or providing theoretical variance? And if it's doing neither, then it doesn't belong, right? Because providing a very rich story with lots of moving parts that kind of don't contribute but are background information, that gets confusing. And kind of keeping that, being very critical about, is this theoretically interesting? And I see this a lot sometimes in papers, like there's this section about something that the organization did, but it doesn't contribute to the model. So why is it there? We don't need to know that if it's not kind of part of the model. And regarding the first versus the second study, this may be just a personal preference, but I'd like to write them subsequently rather than simultaneously, because it's very difficult to keep them apart. You end up confusing them. You end up kind of cannibalizing them by it's very difficult to keep them apart. But as we said at the beginning, it's good to say, okay, for example, you study different groups within the organization. It's a nested case, and it's innovation teams, whatever. And then the way that kind of they worked together is the topic of one paper, but then within group dynamics is the topic of the second paper. So then you have that clearly in your head. Is this within group? Yes, then it belongs to the second paper. I'm not going there. You need to be very critical. And if you try to do it all at the same time, then I find that it becomes too much for your brain. And then you end up creating two papers that look too similar, or that it just doesn't make sense. So I would go in a consecutive manner.
Mhm.
And so have you developed two papers at the same time from the same data?
Not yet. So it's also people think about, but yeah, that could also be just a limitation of your data. Maybe initial data, the design of the study was really focused on one particular question, and maybe it doesn't allow you flexibility to look at some other phenomenon. So yeah, I think that's a tricky thing, but I agree. And that's also the advice I've heard too, to build out the paper sequentially, just because it's you contradict yourself in later papers. Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when you think about that second study, you may want to go back and conduct more interviews in order to complete that second study. So the second study may be a half-baked idea by the time you write the first one, and then you go back and you work in a sequential way, even in data collection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. If I may just relate it to this, I mean, if suppose there's enough data for both papers and you can clearly separate them, when you publish them, do you refer to the same data set? You acknowledge the same amount of interviews, or do you try to kind of carve out, I use this set of interviews for this paper, or eliminate some of the interviews perhaps they're not directly speaking into the second paper? Just some of those kind of little practicalities.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds great. Suho, do you want to go?
Yeah, I would say, that's something I'm also considering too with data from my dissertation, but my inclination would be, just be as transparent as you can with the reviewer. Say, this was from a larger data collection effort about this particular organization. And if for the second paper, say, while the first paper looked at this, we are actually looking at this. So even though it's from the same data set, the data that we're presenting is different. So I think as long as you show that transparency, it gives reviewers like trust. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. There's even when in the submission process, there is actually a question about whether this data has been used in other studies, and you should answer that truthfully and in your cover letter, and sometimes also as a footnote. Obviously you can't reveal author information, but in my second study out of my dissertation, for example, I said, the same data has been used by another study, in parentheses, author identifying information, close parentheses, and then say the differences between the two papers are as follows. I even put that into the paper. You want to make sure that you give all the information and you don't leave room for questioning by reviewers and editors. Oh, and also you mentioned whether you refer to the same data set, or you say, okay, I had a total of 100 interviews, but for this particular, I'm using 30. I actually tend to use the larger numbers, but then I said, and then I clarified that some of these interviews were more relevant than others. But as long as every interview contributed in some way, it's better to not kind of show kind of these smaller patches, but talk about the larger study and say this is the larger study, and out of these the following interviews, like with firms or with regulators, were particularly useful compared to others.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Shall we move on to Zulay? We're almost out of time, so you get to ask the last question, Zulay.
Okay, hi, thank you everyone. Thank you Pinar and Suho for organizing this, and Ibrad. I have a question. A second year PhD student, so I'm looking at cross-sector partnerships to address forced labor in the supply chain to account for those who doesn't have a voice, for instance, survivors. So I was thinking at the beginning to apply grounded theory, which at the moment, but now that I'm digging more into case studies, so I was thinking, since I'm interviewing multiple organizations, stakeholder participants from different organizations to look at the cross-sector collaborations. So I'm hesitating into a single case study or longitudinal case study. So what would you suggest from your perspective?
So I'll say something very quick, maybe, and just and then give the word to you, Suho. Is the phenomenon changing over time or not? If the phenomenon isn't changing, if it's about a current state, and then you don't need longitudinal interviews and your job is easier. But if it's about a process that unfolds, and if you caught it at some point and you need to move it forward to understand how things are changing over time, then you need longitudinal. To me, it's as simple as that.
Yes, there is moving also along with regulations and strategies that the governments are applying. So definitely it's moving every month.
Okay.
So I would, maybe an idea that came to my mind, it sounds like it could possibly be a single case of the cross-sector partnership industry for those victims, and you're interviewing those different players. So that's one way you could group your setting kind of analytically, because multiple cases, if you remember, it relies on that logic of replication. So if you're not getting that because you're interviewing, maybe firms, charities, government, so that might not be helpful for a multiple case. So maybe it's the broader case is that cross-sector partnership on that particular topic, and then you're interviewing those different players. Yeah, so that's one idea.